I think even today, and even with all the different silhouettes we saw, really that Dior silhouette is the one that defines that time. It's the one that had the lasting impression.
He was just interested in making women look very, very beautiful, giving them incredible shape. And in a way, you could argue it wasn't a particularly sexy look. It was very feminine. That was part of its appeal, that women were being put back on pedestals.
It's this kind of throwback to an idyllic past, allowing people to re-experience that kind of thing, and it to be kind of an escape and a haven. That's what his house symbolised, and that's what his clothes symbolised as well.
Christian Dior grew up in Granville, a seaside town in the north of France.
Christian Dior grew up in a rather a very Victorian-looking house. Some people think it's very pretty. I think it's quite odd-looking, but it had the most beautiful outlook. It is right on the beach. And his mother was a very keen gardener, and there were lots of roses. All these things later came into play. They became very favourite motifs of his in his collections.
His mother was a Belle Epoque socialite, and he frequently said that the fashions he designed were inspired by memories of her wardrobe when he was a child.
Age 5, the family relocated to Paris. It was a well-off family, and he had a very happy childhood.
The arts wasn't really considered an appropriate profession, even though Christian, as a young child, expressed an interest in them.
His own early dream was art and architecture, but his family saw him instead in the political field, and they sent him to the École des Sciences Politiques. But you know, that early interest in architecture, I think, is actually very relevant for the kind of clothes that made him famous.
In 1928, Dior opened a gallery. It specialised in the art of the Surrealists and early Cubism and abstract art. There was a provision, his family provided him the money, but he always maintained that his mother was quite insistent that the name Dior could never appear above a shop door.
The Great Depression had an impact on his father's fertiliser business, and there was a real shortage of money, and I think probably the money that was funding this gallery just dried up.
I think it's quite interesting looking at Dior's work, that Dior's fashion is incredibly traditional, but the art that he was proposing then was early Cubism, Surrealist works by people like Picasso and Braque, which obviously even at that point in time were considered incredibly avant-garde and didn't find an enormous audience in Paris. Fashion illustration was the dominant form of depiction of fashion through publications. Photography had begun to be introduced, but was mainly used by high fashion magazines. So in 1935, Dior began working for Figaro as an illustrator. His job was actually to delineate the clothes that other couturiers were proposing. At that point in time, many fashion houses contained different designers who were proposing sketches that were then presented under one name. That's actually how Dior first found his way into haute couture, by proposing sketches to different fashion houses, and he began to work under the label Robert Piguet. Piguet was a couturier. He wasn't a Chanel or a Schiaparelli, who were very much the height of haute couture. But what Piguet allowed Dior to do was to work within a couture house, to experience the actual structure of a couture house.
World War II breaks out and Christian Dior is called up for military service.
As soon as war begins, fashion sort of stands still.
His sister Catherine has joined the resistance, and she does get captured at some point, and ends up in Ravensbrück concentration camp, but survived. And later, Christian Dior named his first perfume Miss Dior after her. And I think it's extraordinary because Miss Dior is one of those lovely, light scents that just conjures up sort of prettiness and the good life. And to think that his sister, who inspired it, had been through such horrors, gives it a whole new dimension.
When France emerged in 1945, you really saw women dressed in the same way they'd been dressed in 1939, which were the broad shoulders, the short, tight skirts, the heavy hats, the heavy shoes. But obviously to French eyes, that really kind of epitomised everything that was wrong, everything that was horrible about the war. That kind of fashion really symbolised oppression.
When he returned to Paris as the war was ending, he first went to work for Lucien Lelong.
Lelong was actually the man that led French couture through the Second World War and ensured that French haute couture could survive in the Second World War. The occupying German forces in 1940 wanted to move French haute couture from Paris to Berlin. And it was Lucien Lelong who insisted that French haute couture exists in Paris or it does not exist at all, forcing kind of the artistic elements of haute couture, but also kind of the economics of couture, how much money haute couture was making for France as a nation and therefore for Germany when they occupied the place. You can kind of see Dior's signature in those pieces at Lelong, which would obviously later come to define his style.
In 1946, Dior met Marcel Boussac, a wealthy textile magnate who was willing to finance Dior's new venture.
Obviously sufficiently impressed with him to lend him the money or to invest in him so that he can set up his own maison in 1946. It's just the war's only just ended. And the fact that all these new couture houses are springing up is just sort of emblematic, I think, of how, in the end, people always want beauty and escapism.
Marcel Boussac was known as the Cotton King in France. He was a French textile millionaire. And in the autumn of 1946, he was looking for investment. He was actually looking to revive an existing French fashion house called Gaston. And he'd heard great things about Christian Dior. Dior had very high-placed friends in French society, for instance, people, both kind of high society and also high artistic society. He was good friends with the editors of Vogue. He was really good friends with Christian Barras, who was a key artist at the time, who worked predominantly in fashion and theatre. And a number of different people had recommended to Boussac that he should see Dior's designs and that Dior might be the man for the job. December 1946, Boussac established the Maison Christian Dior. It was established in a very strange area of Paris. It was actually a predominantly residential area, which now is a bustling kind of luxury thoroughfare, the Avenue Montaigne. But at that point, there were no couture houses there. Dior, however, went to the address where his house now stands and found a lucky playing card on the floor. He was incredibly superstitious. And from that portent, he sensed that the house would be lucky for him. So he insisted against all convention on having his couture house based there. Apparently the space was incredibly impractical. Dior's own office was tiny. He had to give it over to the models for cabine fittings. It wasn't the way that people went about establishing a fashion house. But Dior was happy to break the rules. And again, he relied greatly on tarot cards. He relied greatly on superstition or fortune tellers. And a fortune teller told him that the venture would be a great success, but that the bang of the last hammer would come as the first guests were entering the house. And that's exactly what happened. They were still nailing the carpet down when the first guest came in.
He was very superstitious, as was Coco Chanel, actually. I think number 5 is so called because it was a good number for her. He always consulted a tarot reader before his shows, and Lily of the Valley he considered it a lucky flower, and it's the major component in Diorissima.
He liked to use his favourite flower, Lily of the Valley, somewhere in a collection. There's a dress entirely named after it, of course. And he had a coat called Granville that he used to use for the town where he was born.
He had different lucky emblems that he had to touch. He was superstitious about certain numbers. During his fashion shows, he would always include a red dress, which he considered to be lucky. He'd also sew sprigs of Lily of the Valley into the hems of many of the dresses. When we look at Dior now, it's very much kind of the way that couture houses look. But when Dior actually established the house and began to kind of define the interior decor and things like that, it was really something that hadn't been seen before. The colour scheme and the style of furnishings were taken from Dior's childhood. They were Louis XVI style furniture revived in a Belle Epoque fashion, then redone for the 1940s, which is a very odd chain of events. Dior's first collection in 1947 caused a sensation. A number of key American press and buyers had actually already left Paris and had sailed back to New York. When they arrived, they heard the news of what Dior had shown, had to get back on the boat and return straight to Europe to see it for themselves.
He called it corolle because he spoke of making women look like flowers, and the corolle, of course, is the petals around the heart of a flower, but we all know it by another name. It was the Harper's Bazaar editor Carmel Snow who wrote to him saying, "My goodness, Christian, you've come up with such a new look." And of course, it's the new look that made history.
New designer Christian Dior was chiefly responsible for launching the most recent fashion revolution. Breaking away from the law to open his own establishment, Dior became world famous overnight when his first collection, based on what promptly became known as the New Look, won instant acceptance by the women of fashion.
It wasn't actually new at all. It was harking back to Belle Epoque styles, to Victorian styles, to very traditional views of womanhood. The idea of the waist being restricted and the breasts and hips being emphasised was seen as many people as a really reductive view of femininity, as this idea of emphasising the role of woman as childbearing, a very traditional role of the woman back in the home. After the Second World War, when women had been forced to take up positions in munitions factories, working in hospitals, this was seen as a way of pushing women back into their place. It was seen as really reinforcing traditional views of femininity. In the tradition of fashion, the new look looked new to that which had immediately preceded it.
You could say it was a retrograde step for them, but I think it was very, very beautiful, and women just enjoyed that. And it didn't mean that they had to look like that all the time. They had to wear those clothes all the time, but for special occasions, it really was the prevailing look for another 8, 9, 10 years.
It should be said that there were also people that reacted very strongly against it, particularly in America. There was a group called the Little Below the Knee Club that, when Dior went to tour America in the late 1940s, met him with placards that said, "Monsieur Dior, we abhor dresses to the floor," because they saw the new look as restricted. They saw the new look as preventing them from going about their daily business and from being equal to men. Also in France, I feel that women wearing the new look were sometimes attacked on the streets. There are fantastic images of people shooting models in new look style dresses and enraged women literally coming and ripping them off them. And that's because in France and in Britain, in Europe as a whole, the new look emphasised the haves and the have-nots. It emphasised this idea that certain people, even after a war that had obliterated class and had really brought countries together, it was about emphasising the differences between the poor and the rich.
In Britain, the rationing of fabric was still in place, and famously, when the princesses Elizabeth and Margaret expressed interest in this wonderful new look from France, they were given a private viewing, but they were not allowed to wear this look in public. It just used so much fabric. It was considered unpatriotic.
In the decade between 1947 and 1957, the golden age of couture, everyone wanted to wear Dior.
There were Hollywood stars like Rita Hayworth, like Elizabeth Taylor, European royalty.
He designed costumes for Margot Fontaine and Madame Butterfly. He designed several outfits for the Empress of Japan when she got married. I think that was a 3-day event.
Marlene Dietrich wore Dior. She insisted on having Dior create her wardrobe for her Alfred Hitchcock film, Stage Fright.
Dior was very, very prescient in so many ways, in the way he set up his business, and realising that this total look could be done by one house, that a woman didn't have to go and get her shoes and her bags from different places.
In 1948, he took his designs to America, slightly adapted for that market there. And he was one of the first designers to hire a publicist. So he really was as innovative in the business sense as he was in the design.
By the end of 1949, Dior accounted for 75% of French fashion exports and 5% of France's exports as a whole.
In 1955, Dior appointed the very young, the 19-year-old Yves Saint Laurent as his assistant. 2 years later, he was telling Saint Laurent's mother that her boy, that Yves, would be the next big thing.
In October 1957, Dior went on a spa retreat. He was always trying to lose weight. He suffered a heart attack and died.
The extent of his impact, even then, is sort of illustrated by the fact that when he died, 2,500 people attended his funeral.
In 1958, when Saint Laurent presented his first collection for Dior, it caused a sensation. Many compared it to the sensation Dior had caused himself in 1947, and headlines were printed that said Yves Saint Laurent has saved France. Obviously, what they referred to was the French fashion industry, was the massive industry built around Dior, and was the fact that Saint Laurent's first Dior collection, while different to the tradition of Dior, wasn't too different. It actually wasn't that controversial. It actually wasn't that extreme.
I mean, it was shapeless, but it was beautifully shapeless. It was artfully shapeless. And it was just like a big sort of, it was just like a sack, really. It was every bit as influential, actually, as the new look had been. Women took to it because it was very comfortable and practical. Saint Laurent got drafted into the French army in Algeria.
There was a clause that if Dior insisted that Saint Laurent's presence at Dior was important, that they could block him from being drafted. If he was too essential to the industry, then he wouldn't be drafted into the army.
The House of Dior arguably did not behave terribly well because when Saint Laurent had his nervous breakdown, they fired him. And Marc Boin, who had been in London, came to work for them and lasted for a couple of decades.
Marc Boin was seen as a designer that was much more stable than Yves Saint Laurent, both physically and design-wise. He presented a collection that was lauded by the press, but that was incredibly conservative and safe. And he actually ended up designing for Dior all the way through to 1987. He delivered a constant sense of style to Dior, but Dior was never again on the cutting edge of fashion.
When he was fired, designers always seem to be unceremoniously fired. It's like politics. Gianfranco Ferré was appointed.
Ferré's style, which was extravagant and certainly luxurious. He actually had his own fur and haute couture lines in Italy, which he shuttered to design for Dior, although he continued with his ready-to-wear, were marked by an opulence, which Arnault felt was synonymous with Dior, maybe not with Dior's past, but certainly with the future that he wanted for Dior.
He sort of pinpointed that sculptural architecture of Dior, and his clothes sort of would always have a great big bow at the neck or at the back. They were really magnificent, but probably also starting to look a little bit dated even as he went there. Bernard Arnault, who's the CEO of LVMH, personally hand-picked John Galliano to take over this house in 1997.
It was the hype of haute couture. It was the columns of press that they generated that were actually the payoff. Haute couture has been described by some houses as their advertising budget. And that was really what Galliano excelled at, certainly at the end of the 1990s. Well, I think in the figure of John Galliano, Dior found a creative director that was really harmonious, a creative director that was absolutely in line with the ideas of Monsieur Dior, which was a kind of femininity, a love of structured clothing, and a kind of fantasist.
It was all very, very successful for quite some time. The new rich loved this. It was quite brash, this Dior. And then it all sort of fell apart very dramatically in 2010. Galliano is caught on film in a bar having an absolute sort of racist and anti-Semitic rant. For quite some time they couldn't find a replacement, and that was one of the worst moments for the House of Dior, I would say.
5 months later, they presented their autumn-winter haute couture line with John Galliano's former assistant, Bill Gayton, as chief designer. Gayton designed for Dior for a year, and none of his collections were particularly well received. But in 2012, Raf Simons was appointed as the head designer, presenting his first haute couture in July of that year. Certainly, you describe Simons' style as modern, which I don't think is a word you'd ever use to describe Galliano. And really what he's been charged with is giving a kind of modernist slant to the clothes at Dior.
It's a very modern take on what Christian Dior did, and he's continued now, so 3 years later he's still refining that. It's great to see that the house is sort of on a steady course again.
He himself said that one man can't make a huge fashion trend, that, you know, something in his imagination must have answered to our fantasies.
This is a house that is part of French history. It's national treasure.
What Dior did in one fell swoop in 1947 was to re-establish the primacy, re-establish French haute couture as the dictating force in fashion.